Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Matthew 28. Matthew 28 is where we'll begin here in just a moment. It's good to see each one here. And as we are closing out our year, we've been looking at the subject of leadership throughout the year, using the book of Joshua at the beginning of each month and then preaching other lessons to come alongside that. I want to close out the year looking at what I think is a critical element of leadership. And that is discipleship. In Matthew 28 and verse 19, a passage that I think many of us would be familiar with, Jesus commands, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations." He goes on to tell them to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and to teach them to keep all that I command you. It's been often noted that that's how you make disciples, is baptize them and teach them to do all that Jesus has commanded. But I'd like to think about what the word disciple means, what it meant to people in the first century, what it meant specifically to be a disciple of Jesus, and then how we continue to accomplish that today. The idea of discipleship is one that is, I think, doesn't have precise corollary in our modern context. We can see it here and there, but it is certainly not a saturated concept the same way it would have been in the first century. It's not just that the word, like so many words, it's a religious word, and so over time it gets isolated to that usage and doesn't have the same secular or daily normal connotations, but has kind of this isolated special connotation. In the first century, this word would have been common, right? It would have been something that would refer to many different people. But even our other words that we might use in place of this don't quite, in the modern context, live up to what it would have meant in the first century. A disciple was someone who learned by imitation. If we were to say a disciple, someone who learns, we'd say, what other word would you use? Well, student. Student is what we would say is someone who learns. But what is a student? Well, it's usually somebody sitting in a classroom, at a desk, listening to someone lecture or taking tests and learning in that sort of very formal and structured way. That's not at all the idea that is indicated by this word. The idea would have been much more akin to an apprenticeship, something that, again, we hardly even see in our modern world. If we think today you want to be a learner, you want to be a student, what do? You go and full-time sit in classrooms. You go to a college. That will make you educated. But you're not learning to be like someone. You're not learning how to live a life, how to even have a skill most of the time. It's really just the transfer of knowledge, right? I'm giving you information, and then you are able to answer questions about that information. And then at the end of all of that, we will give you a certificate saying this person has memorized, at least for a moment, enough of this information that he is now qualified to be educated in that field. But then what can you do? Usually, not anything yet. That at the end of education, you're not capable of doing anything. But that really was the goal of education, was a way of living, certainly a way of doing. In Luke chapter 6 and in verse 40, it uses, this is the one place in the Legacy Standard where it translates this Greek word disciple as student. It says, a student is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained, what's the result? He will be like his teacher. Like that's the goal of discipleship, is that you become an imitation, you become an image of the one who has discipled you. So, if we were thinking in terms of apprenticeship, even there, I think there's some distance. Because if we were to say today, if you want to be a carpenter, we have a tech school here in Limestone County, and you want to learn to be a carpenter. Well, then you go to the tech school, and they will teach you the foundations of carpentry, right? They'll teach you from a syllabus, and then here's how you do carpentry. And it will be different than a normal classroom because you'll actually pick up a hammer, you'll actually cut some wood, and actually do the thing that you're learning, which is valuable. But this goes a step further. You would have not just said, I want to be a carpenter, but I want to learn to build things like that man builds things. And that brings us to our next point. That is, you weren't just a student of a subject, you were a student of a person. Even within trades, you were a student of a person. I want to be a carpenter like that man is a carpenter. Not just generically want to be that, I want to build things like he builds things. And so you learn to participate in that trade in the way that he does. If you were to go along and be building later in life, and someone asked you, "Why do you do that?" Because that's the way my master taught me to do that. I do that because he did that, and because he's the one that I devoted myself to. He was my master. In Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, Mark chapter 8. And in verse 34, it says, he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. That is the call of Jesus over and over again. Follow me. Not just follow precepts, though that's included. Jesus followed precepts and he wants them to follow precepts, but follow them in the way that Jesus followed them, right? He's the pattern for how you accomplish that. Schools throughout ancient history were attached to people, not places, right? You didn't go to the University of Athens. You chose someone, or maybe even that person's thoughts and ideas became a school. So Plato had his own school. And then later people would develop Platonic schools. And so if you want to learn to think like Plato, you want to learn to live like Plato. And in fact, that was part of it. We look at these guys, they were just philosophers. But the whole point of philosophy was how you live life. That's Socrates' point, right? It's what does a well-lived life look like? And so you attach yourself, you say, I think this guy has it right. He lives life in the way that I would want to live life. And so I'm going to attach myself to him or to his disciples so that through them I can become one of his disciples. We see this in the New Testament with the school of Tyrannus, for instance. Tyrannus isn't a place, it's a person. Or Gamaliel is someone who was an instructor of men. So you went and put yourself under the tutelage of Gamaliel. And what these men offered was ways of thinking and ways of living so that you could pattern yourself after them. This is ultimately more about how you live than just what you know. In Jeremiah chapter 10, and in verse 2, we find this word for disciple used in the Septuagint, where it says, thus says Yahweh, do not learn the way of the nations, and do not be terrified by the signs of the heavens, although the nations are terrified by them. The word learn there is our word, it's the verb form of our word disciple. Don't become a disciple of the nations. Don't learn to live like they do. Don't learn to think like they think. In what way? How would you do that? Well, he's not saying don't go to their schools. He's saying don't be influenced as you live among them in a way that you become like them. Incidentally, one way you might do that is by going to their schools and doing so not very carefully. But that you ought to recognize there's a difference. I don't want to become a disciple of the nations. I don't want to become a learner of the nations. I want to be different. I want to be like Jesus. I want to be discipled by someone else. Over in Acts chapter 9 and in verse 36, this word is used to describe Tabitha or Dorcas. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 36, it says, "Now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charity, which she did continually." What does it mean when it says she is a disciple? You know, a lot of times we might think of disciple as the apostles, right? The ones that go out and teach, the ones who are those representatives of Christ in that particular way. But Tabitha is not that. She is one who lives like Jesus. And that's borne out in this single verse. Full of good works, full of charity, which she did continually. This is a woman who has patterned her life after Jesus. She's living like he lived. She became a student of him, and therefore one who learned to live life like him. So that's what a disciple is. When we talk about go make disciples, go teach people how to live, which involves, of course, showing them how to live. Well, as we think about that specifically with regards to Jesus, and we think of the imitation of Jesus, one of the things that we find is that there is a distinction in Jesus in the level of devotion that he calls people to. It's not that no one has ever called great levels of devotion, but Jesus commands ultimate devotion. So if you're going to be his disciple, we talked a little bit about this last week, talked about the love of God. What does that indicate? How thoroughly do you give yourself? If you think about becoming an apprentice would generally go live with the person they were apprenticing under. So today, an apprenticeship means that you show up for the job and you've got the 9 to 5 and you go back home. But then it would be you become a part of their household. An apprentice is another son, really, to the master. And he takes and he eats at their table and he sleeps in that guy's bed and he becomes a part of that home. This is the level of connection that Jesus is calling to. When he came along and told his apostles, for instance, "Follow me," that was the level of devotion. Luke chapter 14 and verse 26, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Again, down in verse 30, down in verse 33, it says, "So then none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all of his possessions." When we think about being an imitator of Christ, one of the aspects of that is he says, "Imitate me all the way down to the very last degree. Take up your cross." Every good mother at some point is going to ask their children, "If your friends all jumped off a bridge, would you do it too?" Well, the question here is if Jesus gets on a cross, would you do it too? Yeah, that's how far it would go. So your imitation would include jumping off a bridge if he told me to. That's how far it would go. Now, the distinction between those two is our mothers are trying to warn us against following after bad examples. There can be no limits to following after Jesus' good example. There can be nothing we hold back in following after his good example. But of course, Jesus is not still walking around among us today, and he passed that responsibility on to others. And so that's what we read in Matthew 28 and verse 19. He goes on to say, "You go make disciples." He is going on to be at the right hand of the Father, and he has left those who were with him to go teach others what it was like to be next to Jesus, to live with Jesus, who then ought to pass that on to others, and so on. And sometimes that chain may be broken. And so we have to pick the book back up and we have to rediscover what Jesus was like and what he lived like. And they wrote down those words so that we might always be able to come back and figure it out. But as we live it out, part of the process of teaching is not just reading, not just transferring the information, having Bible classes, having people sit down in desks and answer questions, but to live it out to see what that looks like when somebody puts these things into action. The teaching then was passed on through discipleship. Look at how many times Paul points to example in his instruction to others. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 18, it says, when they had come to him, he said to them, you yourselves know from the first day that I set foot in Asia how I was with you the whole time. The LSB here, the word was is doing a lot of work there. In most of your translations, it will say what manner of life I lived, how I behaved. So it's the way I was. But I do like the translation was there in the LSB for this reason. Was is the past tense of to be. And that is the idea of discipleship. It's a way to be. How is Paul? How does he behave? What is he like? What is it to be Paul? And Paul says, you know what that looked like. And I call upon you to remember that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 1, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Part of Paul's instruction is consistently to live out the principles in a way that not only does he say, remember that sermon that I preached, but remember that life that I lived visibly among you. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 17, brothers, join in following my example and look for those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. Not only follow what we did, but follow the other people who also follow what we did. As that pattern spreads out. Chapter 4 and verse 9, the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 5, 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 5, it says, for our gospel did not come to you in word only, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit with full assurance, just as you know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake. But you also became imitators of us and of the Lord, having received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 7, for you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we did not act in an unruly manner among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with labor and hardship we kept working night and day, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. The truth is heard, but it is also seen. And it is not just Paul pointing to himself throughout these texts, but that Paul gives this instruction to others that they may also provide that teaching that comes through example. He says to Titus in Titus chapter 2 and in verse 7, in all things show yourself to be a model of good works with purity and doctrine, dignified, sound in word which is irreproachable, so that the opponent will be put to shame, having nothing bad to say about us. You teach through the way that you live. He says the same thing to Timothy, and especially with regards to his youth, that he might be an example. In Hebrews, we see the same implication as it's talking about people turning their attention toward their leaders. He says, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Considering the result of their conduct, imitate their faith. This is an aspect of what we're looking for. That if we are someone who wants to be a disciple, then what we're doing is looking around for people who've got the outcome that we want. Right? That's how we find someone to be a disciple of, somebody to imitate. How's that worked out? Has it shown forth that as their life goes on, and as they've had enough experience for us to begin to measure and look and see, has their life played out as one that points to Christ truly? Or are they someone who has a lot of platitudes, but it kind of all falls apart when it gets put into practice? Because there's plenty of that too. Maybe they know the right things to say, but you don't want to live like they live because it's not turning out the right way. And so we look for men and women whose lives, the result of their conduct is something that we want to imitate. So we want to imitate Christ. We want to be like Christ. And one of the ways, and I know it's not the only way, I realize that we compare all of this with the revelation of God's Word, but one of the ways we do that is we ask for a tangible model. What does that look like in real life? It's one of the things that I've always tried to think about in terms of answering questions that the Bible doesn't specifically addresses in principle, is I look for those tangible examples. I think, what does that guy say about that? If he's still around, I call him. If he's not, I think about what I know about him, and I try to imagine how he would have that conversation, how he would answer and respond. And I've tried to give that to my children as I've set before them men and women that I hope that they can look at as people that they want to imitate, that when there are difficult situations, and again, I don't have some book, chapter, verse, it's not some specific thing, but it is a general way of living, it is a way of being, that I ask them, what would this person who we all regard, who we all think of when we think of somebody who's Christ-like, how do you think he would handle this? How do you think she would handle this? And the answer usually in that tense moment is not like I'm handling it right now. But it helps to put a face with what we're talking about, a life with what we're talking about. These are not theories. These are not just lists of things to be memorized. You cannot live life fully, truly, by a list, but by patterns, ways of thinking, ways of being. Well, I want to then think about how that plays out today. Some of the challenges that I think come up as we try to enact this kind of discipleship, as we continue this discipleship. One of the things that I think we have to deal with is the realities of the ways that life is different now from the ways that life was in the first century, for instance. For one thing, we live more fractured lives, and I mean that in just a number of ways. Life is segregated and fractured from the standpoint of it's compartmentalized. So, for instance, learning and living are segregated activities, right? And we talk about that sometimes. We say, it's all well and good to learn something, but at some point we've got to talk about putting it into practice. These were not separate concepts. You think about somebody who is in school, and what do we say? They haven't come in contact with the real world yet. And then maybe from high school they go on to college. Well, it's almost like life got even less real. And then maybe they go into postgraduate studies. This is still not real life. And at some point we say they got to get a job. Well, can I tell you that learning was part of life? Learning and doing were not separate thought processes. Learning and doing was combined and one and the same. And I don't mean that there was no verbal instruction, but that it was almost always in connection with, now let's put that into practice and let's see what that looks like. I think that's one of the things that makes learning so hard for children. I know it is with math. As I was teaching my children math and trying to help them understand certain concepts, one of the most helpful things, is just talking about figuring out the area of a two-dimensional space. And what good is this? Well, tomorrow we're going to measure a job to see how much tile we need to buy. And you're going to see, we're going to use the same things we just talked about to figure out how big of a space that is and how many tiles we need for that. Math in practice. Now, incidentally, when you got to calculus, I had a harder time finding corollaries and making that connection. And some of you are saying, well, I know okay, fair enough. But I didn't. And so I feel more distant from that knowledge. And I think sometimes we feel distant from the knowledge that the Bible gives us because we don't know how that goes into practice. We don't know how that's lived out. And some of that's because we don't live life the way they did. It's not just that we segregate these areas of our life so that, we have our work life and our home life and our leisure life and our hobby life, but our families are fractured, segmented, and hardly live life together. As you think about a child needing to become a disciple of his parents, more and more our families have become distinct in where they go during the day. And how much time does a child spend in the presence of the adults for whom it is most important for him to learn how to live? How much time does a child spend, a son especially spend, watching his father live life? Watching his father live some of the most important parts of life. Seeing him go throughout the day, learning hard work, learning how to manage relationships with other people, how to work together with other people, how to lead other people, how to be led by other people. Or is what a son sees for the most part a man who has already spent his best efforts and his greatest energy by the time he gets home, so that all that's left is a man who's ready to rest. And I understand that. Who's ready for leisure. Who's ready to not have to put the effort in to maintain relationships. What does a son learn from his father? He learns what he sees. And it's all well and good to say, now, I tell him those things. Yeah, but that does not measure up to what he sees in his father. I will say it is good that I hear, even in a fractured world where families still live in proximity, what I heard growing up is the time that boys spent with their grandfather. So at least for a time we still had that. But I think we hardly have that anymore. So that people don't live with each other. They stay in the same hotel. Maybe they eat their meals perhaps at the same table, watch the same television shows if they're not each staring at their own devices, being discipled by any and everybody but the people that are most important. And if our families are fractured, how much more our communities? Families don't live life together, then certainly our families don't live lives with other families in participation and communion with each other. Again, it's leftovers. Our community participation may be at the ballpark. I'm not knocking that. But it's not working together to build things. It's not ways that really deeply build character and relationships. And so, if we're going to practice discipleship, we've got to try to fight uphill against this. That means that if you have a job that keeps you distant from your children, then you've got to redouble your efforts when you are with your children. That if we are going to fill our lives up with all sorts of scheduled things, that we're going to have to make some choices to prioritize the discipleship relationships that even extend beyond the immediate family. Make time for those relationships to bring together communities that are always too busy for each other. In addition to the fractured nature of our lives, we, as a culture, have promoted uniqueness and independence as the greatest virtues. And imitation is not only not a virtue, but becomes a liability. The greatest thing is to be yourself, to find yourself, to go be different, to have distance between you and your parents and your grandparents, to go strike out on your own, both physically and in character and personality. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul commends Timothy because Timothy reminds him of his mother and of his grandmother. I see them in you. I think we notice that sort of thing sometimes. We say, I see you act a lot like, you remind me a lot of your father. You remind me a lot of your grandfather. But do we cherish that? Do we teach our children to cherish that? When someone comes to me and says, when I hear you preach, I hear your grandfather, you can do me no greater compliment than to say that his influence is visible. I want that to be the case. Too often, fathers, we not only don't teach our children to cherish imitation, but maybe we're even afraid of it. I want to make sure that you are being your own man. And I understand there's a way in which that's necessary. But I want to teach my children who they ought to be. And yes, I want to leave room for distinctions in personality and even interests and so forth. But I want to be more thoughtful and more clear in communicating this is who we are. This is what it means to be a part of this family. To pass on to them an identity that they can conform themselves to, not that they're trying to break free from. I think some people are so afraid to trample on those uniquenesses that they won't even help somebody who's looking for the help. I think I've told you this before. I've had studies with preachers for years, profitable for teaching every fall. And on several of those occasions, I've got a group of older men that are teaching, and we have a Q&A panel. And so we've got this group of older preachers that we all regard highly. We respect them. We want to be like them. And men will ask questions about how you do this. How do you study? What are your habits? How do you fit everything in? And they basically would say over and over and over, well, you just kind of got to figure that out for yourself. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get your help. And they say, well, you got to figure out what works for you. Okay, but what worked for you? Because something worked. You did it in a way that makes me want to do it like you're doing it. I want to follow you because I see you following Christ. Now, I will say, be careful what you ask for. Go ask Tom Holly, how do you get to know the Bible like you do? Well, you're probably going to watch a lot less TV because you're going to have to read the Bible a lot. Go ask Brother Waldron. I've told you before, how do I get to know the Bible like you do? Well, you just figure out what is in every chapter of the Bible. There's 1,189 of them. Just know what's in all of them. So get started now. But if you find somebody who's willing to be open about that and say, here's how I got to here, well, you ought to grab hold. That is a precious thing. And I wish we had more of it. Discipleship, then, it's about figuring out how to live life together. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy 6, it says, you shall teach them diligently to your sons and speak of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as phylacteries between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. It's life. It is not enough to set aside quality time. I don't know if you know, that's a fairly modern term. It's a modern term that came about as families were pulled apart by the realities of modern life. And so we recognize we can't spend, time in the normal sense with each other. So because it's so truncated, we'll say, well, let's spend quality time. Well, quality time is better than no time. But the ideal that's presented here is that all the time is quality. That we don't want low quality time. That when we're together, we want to talk in ways and live in ways and act in ways that are conscious and thoughtful of the fact that I am always and every moment teaching. Now, mostly I'm talking about parents and children. But whatever age you are, we need to be looking for people that we want to be like, and then be looking for ways to draw near to them. How can I be closer to you? I found that in my life, most of the time when I have sought those ways out, people are happy to provide those ways. At least in large measure. And so, look around for that. It's a humbling exercise to think of what do I want to be like, and then to find somebody who is closer to that than you are, and ask them how they got there. And then on the other side, we need to pay attention to those who are looking for leadership, and find room in our lives to let them come alongside of us. It can be frustrating or simply time-consuming. Or maybe we just say, I don't know how to teach someone. I'll tell you, you don't have to have some particular gift for education. What you need is to know how you live your life. If someone were to come alongside me and say, can I live life with you for a day? Yes, but you're going to have to be quiet. I can't tell you about every single thing I'm doing. You're just going to have to watch. And that is a lot of what it's about. It's about watching and learning. It's something my father tried very hard to instill in me. I can't remember how many times, I don't know how many times he said, if you will shut your mouth and open your eyes and ears, you will be shocked at how much you can learn. And so at least we could open our lives to that degree. This is so much more than formal instruction. It is about living a life that points to Jesus and inviting others to come alongside. If you're here this morning and you are not a disciple of Christ, then we certainly invite you to become one. We invite you to come and follow him as he has called us, to learn to live like him. And we invite you to find examples of those who are already doing just that and learn from them how to live like him. If you have already become a disciple, perhaps you've lost sight of the master. You've forgotten the one that you pledged to live like, to become like. And if there's any way that we can help you, we also invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.